What happens when two officers make a critical mistake? Arresting a man they think is suspicious only, to discover he's their new chief of police? This story is about redemption, accountability, and the power of change in the face of error. The early afternoon sun cast long shadows across Crestwood's quiet suburban streets. It was a typical Tuesday, the kind of day where the biggest call to the Crestwood Police Department might be a lost pet or a minor bender in a grocery store parking lot. Officers Jake Miller and Chris Sanders sat in their patrol car, cruising down Maple Avenue, both already eager for the end of their shift. Jake, the older of the two, tapped his fingers on the steering wheel, his sharp eyes scanning the road out of habit. He had been with the force for over 10 years, and the quiet rhythm of Crestwood streets had become second nature to him. Chris, his younger partner, sat in the passenger seat, fiddling with the buttons on the radio. "Anything exciting on the scanner?" Jake asked, his tone dry. Chris shook his head, stifling a yawn. "Just Mrs. Langley calling in about kids skateboarding near her driveway again. You'd think after all these years, she'd give up on that one." Jake chuckled, shaking his head. "Classic Langley. You know, one of these days, we should just get her a no skateboarding sign and save ourselves the trouble." The banner was light, the kind of small talk that filled the long hours of uneventful patrols. Crestwood wasn't known for excitement. It was a small town, quiet and safe, the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked and waved at passing officers. But as the patrol car rounded a bend on Maple Avenue, Jake's attention snapped to the side of the road. A beat-up red pickup truck was parked on the shoulder, its hood propped open. Standing next to it was a man, his hands in his pockets and a bright red MAGA hat perched on his head. Jake slowed the car, his instincts kicking in. "We've got something," he said, nodding toward the truck. Chris leaned forward, squinting through the windshield. "Breakdown, maybe?" he suggested. "Could be," Jake replied. "But we should check it out. Make sure everything's okay." Jake pulled the patrol car over, the flashing lights illuminating the truck and the man standing beside it. As they stepped out, Jake adjusted his utility belt, his hand instinctively resting near his sidearm. Chris followed closely behind, his clipboard in hand. The man turned to face them as they approached. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his face weathered but calm. His clothes were clean but slightly wrinkled, as though he had been on the road for a while. "Afternoon, officers," the man said, his voice steady and polite. "Truck's giving me some trouble. Think it might be the radiator." Jake gave a curt nod, his eyes scanning the man and his truck. "You've been here long?" he asked. "About 20 minutes, the man replied. "Called a tow, but they're running behind." Chris jotted something on his clipboard, his expression neutral. "Mind if we take a look at your ID?" he asked. The man hesitated for a fraction of a second before reaching into his pocket and pulling out a wallet. He handed over his driver's license without a word. Jake studied the license, his eyes narrowing slightly. The name David Carter meant nothing to him. The address was for a nearby town, about 30 miles away. Everything seemed in order, but something about the man's calm demeanor made Jake uneasy. "You from around here, Mr. Carter?" Jake asked, handing the license back. "Not really," Carter replied. "Passing through on my way to see some family." Chris glanced at the open hood of the truck, steam faintly rising from the engine. "You said you called for a tow?" he asked. Carter nodded. "That's right. Should be here in the next half hour." Jake and Chris exchanged a glance. It was a routine interaction, nothing out of the ordinary. But Jake's instincts were nagging at him. Something about Carter didn't sit right, not because of anything he had done, but because of what he hadn't done. He wasn't agitated, wasn't flustered. He was too calm, too composed. "Do you have anything else in the truck we should know about?" Jake asked, his tone a little sharper now. Carter's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, disappointment, maybe. "Just some tools and personal items," he said. Jake stepped closer to the truck, peering into the open cab. A duffel bag sat on the passenger seat, partially unzipped. He could see the corner of a notebook and what looked like a bundle of papers inside. "What's in the bag?" Jake asked, gesturing toward it. Carter's jaw tightened slightly. "Just work stuff," he said. Jake felt his unease deepen. "Mind if we take a look?" Carter hesitated, his gaze meeting Jake's. "I'd rather you didn't," he said, his voice calm but firm. That was all Jake needed to hear. He turned to Chris. "Let's secure him," he said. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back." Chris instructed, stepping forward. Carter's shoulders sagged slightly, but he complied without argument. As Chris cuffed his wrists, Carter let out a long, slow breath. "This really necessary?" he asked quietly. "Just doing our job," Jake replied. Though even as he said the words, they felt hollow, building the tension. Back in the patrol car, Jake glanced at Carter through the rearview mirror. The man sat quietly, his hands cuffed in his lap, his red MAGA hat slightly askew. He didn't look angry or scared, just resigned. "You want to tell us why you're acting so suspicious, Mr. Carter?" Jake asked, his tone clipped. Carter met his gaze through the mirror, his expression unreadable. "I didn't realize standing by my truck was suspicious," he said. "It's not just that," Jake said, his voice tightening. "It's the way you're acting, too calm, like you're hiding something." Carter didn't respond. He turned his gaze to the window, watching the trees blur past as the patrol car headed toward the station. Jake's grip on the wheel tightened. Something about Carter's silence was infuriating. It wasn't defiant, wasn't smug, it was something else entirely. The arrival at the station. When they arrived at the station, the atmosphere shifted. As Jake and Chris escorted Carter through the lobby, a few officers glanced up from their desks, their expressions curious. "Who's this?" one of them asked, nodding toward Carter. "Picked him up on Maple Avenue," Jake replied. Something didn't sit right. Carter said nothing, his calm demeanor unchanged. As they led him into an interrogation room, Jake's mind raced. Who was this man? And why couldn't he shake the feeling that he was missing something important? The calm before the storm. Carter sat at the metal table, his cuffed hands resting in front of him. Jake stood across from him, his arms crossed, while Chris leaned against the wall. "Want to tell us what's in that bag?" Jake asked, his tone sharp. Carter sighed, his eyes meeting Jake's. "It's not what you think," he said. "And what do we think it is?" Jake shot back. Carter didn't answer. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his expression almost amused. "You'll find out soon enough," he said quietly. The interrogation room was cold and stark, the kind of place designed to make anyone feel small. David Carter sat calmly at the table, his cuffed hands resting in front of him. His red MAGA hat sat off to the side, the bold lettering catching the fluorescent light. Officers Jake Miller and Chris Sanders stood across from him, their stances tense, their faces a mix of suspicion and frustration. Jake broke the silence first, leaning forward, his arms braced on the table. "All right, Carter, here's the deal. You're not under arrest, but you're not free to go until we figure out what's going on. So let's start with the bag. What's in it?" Carter met Jake's gaze, his expression calm but unreadable. "I told you," he said evenly. "Just some work documents. Nothing illegal." Jake narrowed his eyes. "Then why didn't you want us to look inside?" Carter sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Because I knew this would happen. You see a guy in a MAGA hat on the side of the road and assume the worst." Chris, who had been silent until now, stepped forward. "Don't play the card with us," he said, his voice sharper than Jake's. "You're acting suspicious, and we're just doing our job. If you've got nothing to hide, you shouldn't have a problem letting us check the bag." Carter's gaze flicked between the two officers, his calm demeanor unwavering. "It's not about hiding anything," he said. "It's about principle. I didn't do anything wrong, but here I am, cuffed and interrogated like a criminal. Makes you wonder who's really in the wrong here." Jake exhaled sharply, his patience wearing thin. "Enough," he said, his tone cold. He turned to Chris. "Go get the bag." Chris nodded and left the room, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. Jake turned back to Carter, his jaw tight. "You want to play the victim here, but you're the one who didn't cooperate. If this was all just a misunderstanding, it's on you for making it harder than it needed to be." Carter raised an eyebrow, his expression still calm. "I cooperated just fine. You're the ones making assumptions." Before Jake could respond, Chris returned, the duffel bag in hand. He set it on the table with a heavy thud, and zipping it and pulling out its contents. Inside were neatly organized folders, a laptop, and a small leather notebook. Chris flipped through the papers, his brow furrowing. "Looks like reports," Chris said, holding up one of the folders. "Financial data, personnel records, something about department budgets." Jake frowned, his suspicion deepening. "What is this?" he demanded, turning to Carter. Carter shrugged. "It's work," he said simply. I was on my way to a meeting when my truck broke down. Those are documents for an audit I'm conducting. Jake snorted. An audit? For what? Carter leaned forward slightly, his eyes locking onto Jake's, for the police department. He said, his tone calm but pointed. Specifically, this one. For a moment, the room was silent, the weight of Carter's words hanging in the air. Jake blinked, his suspicion giving way to confusion. What are you talking about? He asked. Carter's lips curved into a faint smile. I'm the new chief, he said. David Carter, appointed by the governor 2 weeks ago. I was on my way here to assess the department when my truck broke down. Jake and Chris froze, their minds racing to process what they'd just heard. Chris was the first to break the silence. Wait, you're the new chief? As in our boss? That's right, Carter said, his tone steady. But you wouldn't have known that, would you? Because instead of asking questions, you made assumptions. You saw the hat, the truck, and decided I must be up to no good. Jake felt his stomach drop. His hands clenched into fists as he tried to maintain his composure. If you're the chief, he said slowly, why didn't you say anything? Carter's gaze hardened. Because I wanted to see how you'd treat me if you didn't know who I was. And now I have my answer. Jake leaned back, his heart pounding. He glanced at Chris, who looked just as stunned as he felt. This can't be real, Jake muttered. Why wouldn't we have been notified about a new chief? Because I wanted to keep it low-key, Carter said. I wanted to see this department for what it is, without all the formalities. And what I've seen so far, it's not great. Chris swallowed hard, his face pale. Look, Chief, we didn't mean. Carter held up a hand, silencing him. Save it, he said sharply. You're not sorry for what you did. You're sorry you got caught. Jake's face burned with shame, but he forced himself to speak. All right, he said, his voice strained. Maybe we made a mistake, but we were just doing our job. We didn't know who you were, and that's the problem, Carter replied. It shouldn't matter who I am, whether I'm the chief, the governor's son, or just some guy on the side of the road. I deserve to be treated with respect. Everyone does. Chris ran a hand through his hair, his frustration bubbling over. With all due respect, Chief, he said, you don't understand what it's like out there. We deal with real threats every day. We can't afford to take chances. Carter's eyes narrowed. Don't you dare try to justify this, he said, his voice low and dangerous. You didn't detain me because I was a threat. You detained me because you assumed I was guilty. That's not policing. That's profiling. Jake felt his chest tighten. He wanted to argue, to defend himself. But deep down, he knew Carter was right. He hadn't let his biases guide his actions, and now he was paying the price. You think you were doing your job? Carter continued. Your job is to serve and protect. To use your judgment, not your assumptions. And right now, you're failing at that. The room fell silent again, the weight of Carter's words pressing down on both officers. Jake stared at the floor, his mind racing with regret. He thought about the moment he had first seen Carter on the side of the road, the assumptions that had flashed through his mind. He had been so sure he was doing the right thing, but now he saw the truth. He hadn't let his biases blind him. Chris cleared his throat, his voice shaky. Chief, what happens now? Carter leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. That depends on you, he said. You've shown me how this department operates when no one's watching. Now, it's time to decide if you're willing to change. Jake looked up, his jaw tight. We'll change, he said firmly. We'll do better. Carter studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. I'll hold you to that, he said. The air in the station was thick with tension as Jake, Miller, and Chris Sanders sat on one side of the interrogation room table, the weight of their actions pressing heavily on their shoulders. Across from them, David Carter, still handcuffed, though unnecessarily, now watched them in silence. His red MAGA hat sat to the side, its bold letters casting long shadows under the fluorescent lights. Sergeant Andrews entered the room, his brow furrowed in confusion. He glanced between Jake, Chris, and Carter before his gaze landed on the duffel bag sitting open on the table. His eyes scanned the folders and papers strewn across its surface, his face paling with each passing second. Why is he in cuffs? Andrews asked, his voice sharp, breaking the suffocating silence. Jake and Chris exchanged uneasy glances. We detained him for questioning, Jake said hesitantly. Andrews' expression hardened. Do you two have any idea who this is? He asked, his voice low but filled with incredulity. Jake swallowed hard, his mouth suddenly dry. He said he's the new chief, he replied, his voice barely audible. Andrews turned to Carter, who had been sitting quietly throughout the exchange. "Chief Carter, is that true?" Andrews asked, his tone softer now, almost apologetic. Carter gave a slow nod, his eyes never leaving Jake and Chris. "It's true," he said simply. "I was appointed 2 weeks ago. Today was supposed to be my first day meeting the department." Andrews' face darkened as the weight of the situation hit him. "You to detain the chief of police?" he asked, his voice rising in disbelief. Chris shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "We didn't know who he was," he said weakly. "He didn't say anything." "I didn't need to," Carter interrupted, his tone calm but firm. "I wanted to see how this department operates when no one knows I'm the chief. And now I know." Andrews took a deep breath, his gaze shifting to Jake and Chris. "All right," he said, his voice steady despite the storm brewing in his eyes. "Explain exactly what happened." Jake cleared his throat, his hands clasped tightly on the table. "We saw him by the side of the road," he began, "next to a truck with the hood open. He said he was waiting for a tow, but something about his story didn't sit right. He was too calm, too composed." "So you cuffed him?" Andrews asked, his voice sharp. Jake hesitated. "We asked to see his bag," he said. "He refused, and it felt suspicious." Carter let out a quiet laugh, his tone dry. "Suspicious," he repeated, "because I wouldn't let you dig through my personal belongings without probable cause?" Chris spoke up, his voice defensive. "We were following protocol," he said. "We thought." "You didn't think," Carter interjected, his voice cutting through Chris' protest like a knife. "That's the problem. You assumed. You saw a man in a MAGA hat and decided he must be up to no good. You didn't ask the right questions. You didn't use your judgment. You just acted on your biases." The room fell silent, Carter's words hanging heavily in the air. Jake stared at the table, his jaw tight. He wanted to argue, to defend himself. But deep down, he knew Carter was right. Andrews rubbed his temples, his frustration evident. "This is a mess," he muttered. "A complete mess." Carter leaned forward, his gaze fixed on Jake and Chris. "You want to know the irony of all this?" he asked. "I was appointed to this position because the governor wanted someone who could address issues like this. Bias, profiling, misuse of authority. And on my first day, I end up as your test case." Jake's stomach churned, the weight of Carter's words pressing down on him like a physical force. "Chief, we didn't mean," he began, but Carter cut him off. "You didn't mean to," Carter said. "But that doesn't change the fact that you did. Intent doesn't erase impact." Andrews sighed heavily, his gaze shifting to Carter. "What do you want to do, Chief?" he asked. "How do we make this right?" Carter was silent for a moment, his expression contemplative. Then he spoke. "The first thing you're going to do is take these cuffs off me," he said, his voice calm but firm. Andrews nodded quickly, moving to remove the cuffs. As the metal clicked open, Carter rubbed his wrists, his expression unreadable. "The second thing," Carter continued, "is that these two are going to take responsibility for their actions, publicly. This isn't going to be swept under the rug." Jake's chest tightened. "Publicly?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. "Yes," Carter said, his gaze piercing. "You made your assumptions in public. You'll own up to them the same way." That afternoon, the entire department was called to the briefing room. The tension was palpable as officers filed in, their murmurs filling the air. Word of the incident had spread quickly, and everyone was eager to hear what was going on. Carter stood at the front of the room, his presence commanding despite the informal setting. Jake and Chris stood off to the side, their faces pale and their posture stiff. "Ladies and gentlemen," Carter began, his voice steady but firm. "As some of you may have heard, there was an incident this morning involving 2 of our officers and myself. Let me be clear, I hold no personal grudge against Officers Miller and Sanders, but their actions highlight an issue that goes far beyond one interaction." The room fell silent, all eyes fixed on Carter. "These officers made assumptions about me based on how I looked and where I was." Carter continued. "They didn't ask questions. They didn't use their judgment. They let their biases guide their actions. And while I commend them for following protocol, I must emphasize that protocol is a tool, not a shield for poor decision-making." He turned to Jake and Chris, his expression softening slightly. "Officers Miller and Sanders have agreed to take responsibility for their actions," he said. "They've acknowledged their mistakes, and they're committed to learning from them." Jake stepped forward, his heart pounding. He cleared his throat, his voice shaky but sincere. "I want to apologize," he said, "to Chief Carter, to my fellow officers, and to this community. I let my assumptions get the better of me, and I made a mistake. I'll do everything in my power to make sure it doesn't happen again." Chris followed, his voice quieter but equally sincere. "I'm sorry too," he said. "We didn't handle the situation the way we should have. I know we need to do better." After the meeting, Carter called Jake and Chris into his office. The tension from earlier had eased, but the weight of the day's events still lingered. "I appreciate your willingness to take responsibility," Carter said, his tone measured. "But this is just the beginning. If we're going to rebuild trust, both within this department and with the community, we need to do more than apologize. We need to act." Jake nodded, his resolve strengthening. "What do you need us to do, Chief?" he asked. Carter leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. "First, you're going to undergo additional training," he said. "De-escalation, critical thinking, cultural sensitivity. It's not optional." "Understood," Chris said, his voice firm. "Second," Carter continued, "I want you to take what you've learned and share it with the rest of the department. Lead by example. Show your colleagues that change starts with us." Jake and Chris exchanged a glance, both nodding in agreement. "We'll do whatever it takes," Jake said. Carter's expression softened slightly. "Good," he said, "because this isn't just about fixing what went wrong today. It's about building a better future for all of us." The atmosphere in the Crestwood Police Department had shifted dramatically. The arrest of their new chief had sent ripples through the department, the town, and even the local news. For Jake Miller and Chris Sanders, the weight of their actions was heavier than ever as they faced the consequences of their choices. Jake sat at his desk in the corner of the station, staring at the screen of his computer but unable to focus. The harsh light of the office felt oppressive, and the whispers from his colleagues made his skin crawl. He couldn't blame them. After all, he had handcuffed the very man who now led their department. Chris sat across from him, his usual humor absent. "This is a nightmare," Chris muttered, his voice low. "Every time someone looks at me, I feel like they're thinking, 'There's the guy who cuffed the chief.'" Jake leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his face. "They are," he said bluntly, "and they're right." Chris sighed, slumping forward. "We screwed up, Jake, big time. I mean, how do we even come back from this?" Jake didn't answer. He didn't know if they could. Meanwhile, Chief David Carter was meeting with Sergeant Andrews in his office. The room was quiet, save for the ticking of a clock on the wall. Carter sat behind his desk, his expression calm but thoughtful as Andrews stood before him. "You've handled this well so far, Chief," Andrews said, breaking the silence. Calling the meeting, addressing the department, it was the right move. Carter nodded slowly. "It's a start," he said, "but it's not enough." Andrews tilted his head. "What do you mean?" Carter leaned forward, his hands clasped on the desk. "This isn't just about two officers making a mistake," he said. "It's about the culture that allowed it to happen. If we don't address the root of the problem, it'll happen again, and next time. The consequences might be far worse." Andrews frowned, nodding thoughtfully. "So what's the plan?" "We start with accountability," Carter said. "Not just for Miller and Sanders, but for everyone. I want every officer in this department to undergo training de-escalation, bias recognition, cultural sensitivity, and I want it to be mandatory." Andrews raised an eyebrow. "You think the department's ready for that?" "They'd better be," Carter said firmly, "because if we don't fix this, we're not just failing ourselves, we're failing the community." News of the incident had spread throughout Crestwood, and the community was divided. Some residents were outraged, demanding Jake and Chris be fired for their actions. Others defended the officers, arguing that they had been following protocol. At the local diner, a group of residents gathered around a table, their voices low but heated. "I can't believe they treated the chief like that," one man said, shaking his head. "It's embarrassing." "Embarrassing? It's dangerous," a woman countered. "What if it had been someone else? Someone who didn't have the chief's position to back them up?" Another man chimed in. "Come on, they were just doing their job. They didn't know who he was." "That's the problem," the woman snapped. "They didn't know, and they didn't care. They saw a guy in a MAGA hat and assumed he was trouble. That's not doing their job, that's profiling." The debate continued, the diner buzzing with tension. The incident had struck a nerve in Crestwood, forcing the town to confront uncomfortable truths. about its police department and itself. Back at the station, Jake and Chris were called into Chief Carter's office. The tension was palpable as they stepped inside, the door clicking shut behind them. Carter sat behind his desk, his expression calm but unreadable. "Sit down," Carter said, gesturing to the chairs in front of his desk. Jake and Chris complied, their postures stiff. For a moment, Carter said nothing, his gaze shifting between the two officers. Then he spoke. "I want you to understand something," he began, his voice steady. "This isn't just about what you did to me. It's about what your actions represent. When you handcuffed me, you weren't just arresting your chief. You were undermining the trust this department is supposed to have with the community." Jake nodded, his throat tight. "We know," he said quietly, "and we're sorry." "Sorry isn't enough," Carter said bluntly. "Actions have consequences, and you need to face yours." Chris leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "What do you want us to do, Chief?" he asked. Carter's gaze hardened. "First, you're going to apologize publicly," he said. "Not just to me, but to the department and the community. Second, you're going to undergo mandatory training. And third, you're going to take what you've learned and use it to help this department do better." Jake and Chris exchanged a glance. The prospect of facing the public was daunting, but they knew Carter was right. "We'll do it," Jake said firmly. The following weekend, a town hall meeting was held at the Crestwood Community Center. The room was packed, residents eager to hear from the officers who had detained their new chief. At the front of the room, a podium stood waiting, flanked by rows of chairs. Jake and Chris stood off to the side, their nerves evident as they watched the crowd. Carter stood with them, his presence a steadying force. "You're doing the right thing," Carter said quietly. Jake nodded, his palms sweaty. "I hope so," he muttered. When it was time to speak, Carter addressed the crowd first, explaining the situation and emphasizing the need for accountability. Then, he stepped aside, motioning for Jake and Chris to take the podium. Jake cleared his throat, his voice shaky as he began. "Good evening," he said. "My name is Officer Jake Miller, and this is my partner, Officer Chris Sanders. We're here tonight to take responsibility for our actions." He paused, scanning the crowd. "Last week, we made a mistake. We detained Chief Carter without cause, based on assumptions that were wrong and unfair. We failed to uphold the values this department stands for, and for that, we are deeply sorry." Chris stepped forward, his voice quieter but equally sincere. "We know that words aren't enough," he said. "That's why we're committed to doing better through training, education, and by holding ourselves accountable every day." The crowd was silent for a moment, the weight of their words sinking in. Then, a few people began to clap, the applause growing louder until it filled the room. Jake and Chris exchanged a glance, their relief palpable. In the weeks that followed, Jake and Chris threw themselves into the department's new training programs. The sessions were challenging, forcing them to confront their biases and reflect on their actions. But they were determined to make the most of the opportunity, knowing it was their chance to rebuild trust with the community, the department, and themselves. Carter kept a close eye on their progress, offering guidance and support when needed. He pushed them hard, but was quick to acknowledge their efforts. Slowly but surely, the atmosphere in the department began to change. One evening, as Jake was leaving the station, he spotted Carter in the parking lot. Hesitating for a moment, he approached the chief. "Chief," he said, his voice hesitant, "I just wanted to say, thank you for giving us a second chance." Carter turned to him, his expression thoughtful. "You earned it," he said simply, "but don't waste it." Jake nodded, a sense of purpose settling over him. The road ahead would be long, but for the first time, he felt ready to walk it. The morning air was crisp as the sun rose over Crestwood, casting warm light on the quiet town. It had been 3 weeks since the incident that had shaken the police department and left Officers Jake Miller and Chris Sanders grappling with their actions. Those weeks had been grueling, filled with public scrutiny, difficult conversations, and intense training, but they had also been transformative. In the briefing room of the Crestwood Police Department, the atmosphere was charged with a sense of anticipation. Chief David Carter stood at the front of the room, his presence commanding as he addressed the department. Jake and Chris sat near the back, their expressions solemn but determined. "As you all know," Carter began, his voice steady and clear. "The past few weeks have been challenging for this department and for this community. The actions of two of our officers highlighted issues we can no longer ignore. But those challenges have also given us an opportunity to grow, to learn, and to do better. He paused, his gaze sweeping the room. Today marks the end of the mandatory training program we implemented. Every officer in this room has taken part in workshops on de-escalation, bias recognition, and cultural sensitivity. And while the training is over, the work is just beginning. Jake shifted in his seat, the words hitting close to home. The training sessions had forced him to confront uncomfortable truths about himself, truths he couldn't ignore. He had seen firsthand how his assumptions had hurt not only Chief Carter, but also the trust he had worked so hard to build with the community. Carter turned his attention to Jake and Chris, his gaze steady. Officers Miller and Sanders have been at the center of this journey, he said, and today they're going to share what they've learned. Jake's chest tightened as Carter gestured for him and Chris to come forward. The room was silent as they stood, the weight of every gaze following them to the front of the room. Jake could feel his pulse pounding in his ears, but he forced himself to focus. Jake stepped up to the podium, his hands gripping the edges tightly. He took a deep breath before speaking. 3 weeks ago, I made a mistake, he began, his voice steady but low. I let my assumptions guide my actions instead of my training, my judgment, or my respect for the people I serve. That mistake didn't just harm Chief Carter, it harmed this department, this community, and the trust we're supposed to uphold. He paused, the weight of his words settling over the room. I won't stand here and make excuses. What I did was wrong. But these past few weeks have been about more than just acknowledging that. They've been about understanding why it happened and committing to making sure it never happens again. Chris stepped forward next, his voice quieter but no less sincere. The training we've gone through has opened my eyes to things I didn't want to see about myself, he said. It's been hard, but it's also been necessary. I know now that being a good officer isn't just about following rules or procedures. It's about thinking critically, treating people with respect, and doing what's right, even when it's uncomfortable. The room was silent for a moment before Carter stepped forward, his expression thoughtful. Thank you, Officers Miller and Sanders, he said. Your willingness to take responsibility and learn from this experience is a step in the right direction. But as I said before, this is just the beginning. Accountability isn't a one-time event, it's a commitment we make every day. Later that afternoon, Jake and Chris found themselves back at the community center, this time for a public event hosted by the department. The goal was to engage with the residents of Crestwood, listen to their concerns, and begin rebuilding trust. The center buzzed with activity as families, business owners, and local leaders filled the space. There were booths set up with information about the department's new training programs, as well as officers stationed throughout the room ready to answer questions. Jake and Chris stood near the entrance, greeting residents as they arrived. It was awkward at first. Many people gave them skeptical looks, and a few even made pointed comments about the incident. But as the hours went on, the tension began to ease. One moment stood out in particular. An older woman approached Jake, her expression a mix of curiosity and skepticism. You're one of the officers who arrested the chief, aren't you? She asked. Jake nodded, his posture respectful. Yes, ma'am, that was me. The woman studied him for a moment before speaking. You know, I was furious when I heard about what happened. But I have to say, it takes guts to admit you were wrong. And from what I've seen today, it looks like you're trying to make it right. Jake felt a wave of relief wash over him. Thank you, he said sincerely. We are trying, and we'll keep trying. As the event wound down, Jake found himself standing outside the community center, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The day had been exhausting but fulfilling, a reminder of why he had joined the force in the first place. He heard footsteps behind him and turned to see Chief Carter approaching. The two men stood in silence for a moment, watching as the last rays of sunlight disappeared. You did good today, Carter said finally, his voice quiet but firm. Jake glanced at him, his expression uncertain. I'm not sure I deserve that, he admitted. Not after what I did. Carter turned to face him, his gaze steady. You made a mistake, he said. A big one. But what matters is how you've handled it since. You took responsibility. You faced the consequences. And you're working to make things right. That's more than a lot of people would do. Jake nodded, his chest tightening. Thank you, he said quietly, "for giving us a second chance." Carter's lips curved into a faint smile. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "The real work is just beginning." As the weeks turned into months, the changes within the Crestwood Police Department became more evident. The training programs implemented by Carter became a permanent part of the department's culture, and officers began to approach their work with a renewed sense of purpose. For Jake and Chris, the journey was far from over. Every day was a reminder of the responsibility they carried, not just to enforce the law, but to uphold the values of fairness, respect, and integrity. They still faced skepticism from some residents, but they were determined to prove themselves through their actions. One evening, as Jake patrolled the quiet streets of Crestwood, he reflected on how far he had come. The incident with Carter had been a wake-up call, forcing him to confront the biases and assumptions he hadn't even realized he carried. It had been painful, humbling, and necessary. As he turned onto Main Street, he spotted a man standing by the side of the road next to a broken-down car. The man wore a worn jacket and a tired expression, his hands shoved into his pockets. Jake pulled over, his headlights cutting through the gathering dusk. He stepped out of the patrol car and approached the man, his posture relaxed. "Evening," he said, his tone warm. "Need some help?" The man looked up, startled at first but quickly relaxing. "Yeah," he said. "Car won't start." Jake smiled. "Let's see what we can do," he said, reaching for his flashlight. And as he worked to help the man, Jake felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. He wasn't just an officer doing his job, he was a part of something bigger, something better.